5 predators. That's what you're about to learn killed and maimed more American soldiers in Vietnam's swamps than most people realize. These aren't the stories you learned in history class about heroic battles or strategic victories. This is the raw, unfiltered reality of what lurked beneath the murky water and thick vegetation, the biological threats that turned every step through a swamp into a potential death sentence. Veterans specifically requested we cover this topic because, for decades, these fears have been dismissed, minimized, or completely ignored in favor of more dramatic combat narratives. But if you actually served in the Mekong Delta or the U Minh Forest, you know the truth. The enemy wasn't always wearing black pajamas and carrying an AK-47. What you're about to hear comes from declassified medical records, veteran testimonies, and military reports that were buried for years. If you think you know what soldiers feared most in Vietnam, you're probably wrong. Let's get into it. The Vietnam War placed American troops in one of Earth's most hostile ecosystems, tropical swamps teeming with apex predators that had evolved over millennia to kill efficiently in murky water and dense vegetation. While the Viet Cong adapted to this environment, most American soldiers came from temperate climates with zero experience navigating swamps where visibility dropped to inches and every ripple could mean death. Military medical reports from 1965-1973 document over 12,000 non-combat casualties directly attributed to animal attacks in wetland areas. That number is conservative. It only includes documented cases where soldiers reached medical facilities. Countless others died in remote areas where their bodies were never recovered, their deaths attributed to missing in action rather than biological threats. Why isn't this discussed more? Because admitting that American soldiers were terrorized by wildlife undermines the narrative of technological superiority. It's easier to talk about helicopters and napalm than acknowledge that an 18-year-old from Iowa could be dragged underwater by a creature he'd only seen in zoos. These 5 threats weren't just dangerous, they were psychologically devastating in ways that conventional combat couldn't match. The ultimate ambush predator. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. Saltwater crocodiles in the Mekong Delta region reached lengths of 20 feet and weights exceeding 2,000 pounds, larger than most reported in modern times due to abundant food sources and lack of hunting pressure during the war years. According to military records from the 196th Light Infantry Brigade, these animals could remain submerged for up to 2 hours, waiting in complete stillness until prey entered the water. Their bite force, measured at over 3,700 psi, could crush a human femur like a twig. Marines operating in coastal mangrove swamps reported crocodile populations so dense that night patrols could hear them, bellowing from multiple directions, a territorial display that served as a constant reminder of what owned these waterways. What made saltwater crocodiles particularly nightmarish was their killing method. Veterans described watching fellow soldiers grabbed by the leg or torso and immediately pulled into a death roll, a violent spinning motion that drowned victims while simultaneously tearing flesh and breaking bones. One Marine Corps corpsman stated in a 1969 documented interview, "I saw a crocodile take Jenkins under in maybe 4 seconds. The water turned red, we fired into it, but we never saw either of them again." The animal's armored hide made them nearly impervious to M16 fire unless hit in specific vulnerable spots, eyes, throat, or underbelly, which were impossible to target during an attack. Medical evacuation reports detail soldiers recovered with massive crush injuries and limbs torn away, many having drowned before the animal even began feeding. Veterans consistently described the paranoia of wading through chest-deep water, knowing crocodiles could be within arm's reach. The animals left no ripples, no warning, no chance to fight back. Unlike firefights where you could return fire, crocodile attacks happened in fractions of a second with zero opportunity for defense. One Army specialist described in an oral history, "You could be standing next to your buddy one moment, turn around, and he'd just be gone. Just bubbles and blood coming up." The psychological toll manifested in soldiers refusing to enter water even under direct orders, accepting Article 15 charges rather than risk becoming prey. Sleep became impossible in forward positions near waterways. Every splash, every movement in the darkness could be a 2,000-pound predator approaching. The worst-case scenario occurred during river crossings or amphibious operations when entire squads entered water simultaneously. Declassified after-action reports from Operation Sea Lords document at least 7 incidents where multiple soldiers were attacked during single river crossings, with crocodiles apparently drawn by the disturbance and blood in the water. In one horrific case from 1968, a reconnaissance patrol crossing the Bassac River lost 4 men to what witnesses described as at least 3 large crocodiles that attacked within minutes of each other. Survivors reported firing over 200 rounds into the water with minimal effect. The incident resulted in a policy change requiring air support reconnaissance before any water crossing in known crocodile territory, a policy routinely ignored due to operational tempo. The second fear involved something even more widespread and medically devastating: the silent chemical killers. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. Southeast Asia's king cobras, growing up to 18 feet long and capable of delivering 1,000 milligrams of venom per bite, represented an entirely different threat category than American soldiers had trained for. According to military medical studies, the venom's neurotoxins caused respiratory paralysis within 30 to 60 minutes if untreated, and the anti-venom supply chain in remote swamp areas was essentially non-existent. Field medics carried morphine and antibiotics, but rarely antivenom due to storage requirements and shelf life limitations. Banded crates, smaller but equally deadly, were nocturnal hunters that regularly crawled into sleeping bags and fighting positions, attracted by body heat. Medical evacuation reports document 89 confirmed crate bites during the war, with a fatality rate exceeding 70% when bites occurred more than 2 hours from medical facilities. What amplified the snake threat was Vietnam's swamp environment: thick vegetation, poor visibility, and constant wading through water where snakes swam with only their heads visible. One reconnaissance Marine described in a 1970 testimony, "We'd be moving through elephant grass in 3 feet of water, and you'd just feel something brush your leg. Half the time it was nothing. The other half, someone was screaming for a medic." King cobras, unlike American rattlesnakes, gave minimal warning before striking. No rattle, just a hood flare that was invisible in thick vegetation. The snakes could strike with accuracy up to 1/3 their body length, meaning an 18-foot cobra could deliver a killing bite from 6 feet away, longer than most engagement distances in jungle firefights. Soldiers reported finding cobras coiled in trees, floating in waterways, and even inside abandoned enemy bunkers, turning every movement into a potential death sentence. Veterans consistently describe the unique horror of watching snakebite victims die. Unlike the instant shock of gunshot wounds, cobra venom killed slowly and terrifyingly. Victims remained fully conscious as their diaphragms paralyzed, and they slowly suffocated. Medics performed emergency tracheotomies in the field, manually ventilating victims for hours during evacuation, but survival rates remained devastatingly low. One Navy corpsman stated in a documented interview, "The worst part was they could still see you, still understand what was happening, but they couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't scream. Just their eyes, getting wider and wider." The psychological impact on witnesses was profound. Multiple reports document soldiers refusing to sleep on the ground, instead rigging hammocks in trees where crates couldn't reach them, only to encounter arboreal cobras that hunted in canopy. The nightmare scenario wasn't a single snake. It was operating in areas where snake populations reached saturation levels. Declassified reports from Special Forces camps in the U Minh Forest document perimeters where soldiers killed 15 to 20 cobras per week within defensive positions. During monsoon seasons, rising water drove snakes into dry areas, concentrating them in exactly the elevated positions where Americans established bases. After-action reports detail multiple instances of soldiers bitten while on guard duty, relieving themselves, or sleeping in bunkers. Deaths that went unreported in official casualty statistics because they weren't combat-related. The Army eventually issued snakebite protocols, but the reality was that in remote swamp areas, a cobra bite was effectively a death sentence unless evacuation occurred within the venom's incubation period, a window that closed long before helicopters could reach most positions. The third fear was smaller, but statistically more deadly than crocodiles and snakes combined. The invisible biological warfare. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. Anopheles mosquitoes in Vietnam's swamps transmitted Plasmodium falciparum malaria, the deadliest strain, at rates that overwhelmed preventive measures. According to military medical records, over 80,000 American soldiers contracted malaria during the war, with infection rates in swamp operating units reaching 40 to 60% annually. The parasites caused cyclical fevers exceeding 105 °C, severe anemia, and in cerebral malaria cases, seizures and death within 48 hours. Chloroquine prophylaxis, the standard prevention, proved only 60% effective against Vietnam's drug-resistant strains. One Army medic described in a 1971 testimony, "We'd have entire platoons go down with fever at once. You couldn't operate, couldn't patrol, just guys shivering and vomiting in the mud while Charlie knew exactly where we were." Beyond malaria, swamp mosquitoes transmitted dengue fever, Japanese encephalitis, and filariasis, a parasitic disease causing permanent disfigurement. Medical evacuation reports document soldiers infected with multiple diseases simultaneously, their immune systems catastrophically overwhelmed. The mosquitoes bred in stagnant water that covered 70% of operational areas during monsoon season, creating billions of vectors that swarmed in clouds so thick soldiers inhaled them. Insect repellent proved minimally effective in high humidity, sweating it off within hours, and the mosquitoes bred resistance to early DDT applications. Veterans describe sleeping under netting that mosquitoes penetrated anyway, waking with hundreds of bites despite precautions, knowing each bite carried potential infection. Veterans consistently describe malaria not as a single illness, but as a recurring nightmare that continued decades after leaving Vietnam. The parasites remained dormant in liver cells, reactivating periodically to cause fever attacks years or even decades later. Unlike combat wounds, malaria attacks were unpredictable, striking during family gatherings, job interviews, or normal daily life, constantly reminding veterans of Vietnam's swamps. One infantry sergeant stated in an oral history, "I've had malaria attacks in 1969, 1974, 1982, and 1995. Every time it comes back, I'm in that fucking swamp again, hearing the mosquitoes, feeling the fever cooking my brain." The psychological toll of this, recurring biological invasion, your body becoming a permanent battlefield, drove many veterans to substance abuse and suicide, their deaths never attributed to Vietnam in official statistics. The worst medical reality was operating in regions where disease was simply assumed. Declassified medical studies show that in some units operating in the Mekong Delta, over 90% of soldiers tested positive for malaria antibodies, meaning nearly every soldier had been infected at least once. Field hospitals reported cases of soldiers with malaria, dengue, and dysentery simultaneously, their bodies fighting multiple biological invasions while still expected to patrol and engage enemy forces. The military's solution, massive anti-malarial drug dosing, created its own problems, with mefloquine causing hallucinations, paranoia, and psychotic episodes. Soldiers faced an impossible choice. Take drugs that might make you mentally unstable or refuse them, and almost certainly contract malaria. This biological warfare killed more Americans than many conventional battles. The fourth fear lurked in the water itself, invisible until it was too late. The blood-drinking occupiers. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. Vietnam's land leeches, primarily Haemodipsa sylvestris, could detect carbon dioxide and body heat from 10 feet away, actively pursuing human hosts through swamp vegetation. According to military medical reports, soldiers wading through swamps accumulated 30 to 50 leeches per hour of exposure, the parasites secreting anticoagulants that caused wounds to bleed for hours after removal. Each leech consumed up to 50 ml of blood before detaching, and soldiers in prolonged swamp operations lost enough blood to cause clinical anemia requiring transfusions. The leeches injected an anesthetic during attachment, meaning soldiers often didn't notice them until they'd been feeding for hours, swelling to thumb-sized masses. One Marine platoon commander described in a 1968 documented interview, "We'd stop for breaks, and guys would pull off anywhere from 20 to 60 leeches. Your socks would be soaked red, blood running into your boots." Veterans consistently describe leeches as the most psychologically disturbing aspect of swamp operations, not because they were deadly, but because they represented an intimate, continuous invasion of your body. Unlike enemy soldiers you could fight or animals you could avoid, leeches were everywhere, constantly attaching, constantly feeding, turning your own flesh into their feeding ground. One infantry specialist stated in an oral history, "You could feel them moving on you, under your clothes, but you couldn't stop to deal with them during patrols. You just had to keep moving with these things literally sucking your blood." The helplessness, knowing parasites were feeding on you but being unable to stop it, created a profound sense of violation. Soldiers reported nightmares about leeches decades after the war, phantom sensations of something crawling on their skin, a psychological scar that never healed. The nightmare wasn't a single leech encounter. It was operating in swamps where leeches were simply part of existence. Declassified reports from riverine operations document sailors pulling dozens of leeches off themselves after every patrol, their uniforms soaked with blood, standing in ankle-deep water aboard boats while removing parasites. Some units reported soldiers developing psychological breaks from the constant leech exposure, refusing to enter water even when tactically necessary, the cumulative psychological weight of continuous parasitic invasion breaking combat effectiveness. Medical studies documented soldiers developing severe anemia from blood loss, requiring iron supplementation and blood transfusions, their bodies literally drained by thousands of parasitic attacks over months of deployment. This wasn't dramatic or heroic. It was degrading biological warfare that reduced soldiers to hosts for parasites. The fifth and final fear combined all the others into one inescapable reality. The 1,000-pound rage machines. Let's break down why this was such a pervasive fear. Asian water buffalo, standing 5 to 6 feet at the shoulder and weighing up to 2,600 pounds, occupied the same swamps and rice paddies where American patrols operated. According to military records, water buffalo killed or seriously injured over 200 American soldiers during the war, goring them with horns spanning 5 feet or trampling them into mud where they drowned. Unlike predictable predators, water buffalo aggression was completely random. They might ignore entire platoons one day and attack individual soldiers the next with zero warning. The animals could reach speeds of 30 km/h in short bursts, impossible to outrun in swamp terrain where every step sank into mud. One reconnaissance soldier described in a 1970 testimony, "We called in more airstrikes on water buffalo than enemy positions. They'd charge through our patrol, scattering us, and Charlie would hit us while we were disorganized." What amplified the water buffalo threat was the chaos of combat environments. When firefights erupted near rice paddies, water buffalo, already territorial, became enraged by gunfire and explosions, charging anything that moved. After-action reports document incidents where wounded buffalo, hit by stray bullets, attacked American positions with suicidal aggression, their mass and momentum allowing them to penetrate defensive perimeters and trample soldiers in fighting positions. The animal's thick hide and bone structure meant M16 rounds often failed to stop them. Multiple documented cases exist of buffalo absorbing 20-30 rounds before dropping. Veterans described the surreal horror of taking cover from enemy fire while simultaneously being charged by a ton of enraged animal, unable to determine which threat was more immediate. The nightmare scenario involved the rules of engagement. Water buffalo were civilian property, technically off-limits unless directly attacking. Declassified operational reports document soldiers punished for shooting buffalo in self-defense, creating hesitation that got people killed. Units operating in hostile areas faced impossible choices: shoot charging buffalo and face Article 15 charges plus ARVN complaints, or don't shoot and risk being trampled. This created cognitive paralysis in combat situations where split-second decisions determined survival. Military studies indicate this confusion contributed to at least 40 documented American deaths where soldiers hesitated to engage charging buffalo due to ROE concerns. The psychological toll of being more afraid of paperwork than a charging animal broke unit cohesion and trust in command. If you're a Vietnam veteran watching this, especially if you operated in the Mekong Delta, the U Minh Forest, or the coastal mangroves, thank you for your service and sacrifice. The biological warfare you endured deserves recognition alongside the combat actions. If you have stories about these threats that haven't been told, please share them in the comments. Your experiences matter, and sanitized history needs correction. To everyone else, like, subscribe, and share this for more historical content that goes beyond sanitized versions and honors what was actually endured. Remember what was asked of these soldiers. Thank you for watching.